Hi ladies, this week we're talking about the information processing theory. I'm going to run through much of this PowerPoint because it's a pretty dense chapter and I don't want this video to last more than 30 minutes. But I hope to make things that at least I found a little difficult, less confusing and more clear. So let's get started. We're talking about the cognitive information processing system, and it's really not one theory, but it's really a combination of theories about how internally learning happens, how we process information that comes in, how we connect it to information and learning that you already have. So basically it addresses how we attend to environmental events or stimulus or our senses, how we then process or connect and code the information to be learned, and then how we get what we take in to go and be stored in our memory and retrieved when we need it later. So there are some precursors to contemporary information processing theories that I'll just briefly mention. The first is the verbal learning theories or research, and that was really research geared at how does memory work. And so what they found was in terms of how we learn verbally, they focused on three things: serial learning, and they found that people tend to recall verbal messages in the order that it was presented or received. So if I give you a list of 5 things that I want you to remember, you'll tend to recall them in the order presented. Paired associate research found that learners tend to organize information into meaningful associations. So even if you don't give them the information in pairs, they tend to organize it that way. So if I say dog, cat, bird, mouse, then you might associate mouse and cats and dogs and birds, or the other way around, but probably not birds and mice. So that's the paired associate theory. And then the last is free recall. And what they found was when they gave a large list of information and wasn't given in any specific order, what people will remember is the first, or what they call primacy bias, and the last, also called recency bias. And some of the reason for this is because what you heard first, you may tend to rehearse more and longer, and then what you hear last is still in at least what some call short-term memory. So that's verbal learning and the research that came out of that. The second is Gestalt theory, and specifically how it relates to learning. Researchers Kafka and Kohler, or theorists Kafka and Kohler, looked at how Gestalt theory is attributed to learning and how objects or events are viewed as a whole rather than individual parts. So if you see a tree, what you put together in your mind that it's a tree, you don't focus on the leaves, the bark, the trunk, the branches, but you tend to view it as a whole. And when we're given pieces of information, we tend to organize them into a whole rather than just memorize or deal with the pieces of information. Out of Gestalt theory, also we had principles related to how we organize these perceptions. So the visual things that come in, and they talked about things such as proximity, when we look at things and perceive things visually, how we will classify them in terms of their closeness to one another, which is proximity, or their similarity to each other, or will memorize or take into account the more simplistic rather than the more complex. And so it will be important to break down things from its most complex to its simplest forms. And then lastly, Gestalt really said that meaningful perception and insight occur only through the conscious awareness. So they felt that you had to be consciously aware of what you were learning and what was going on in your perception. Then there was the two-store model that our text talks about, and really those two, it's a model that says there are two ways that we store information. Short-term memory and long-term memory. Those are the two ways that we store information according to this model. So short-term memory is limited in capacity, meaning the amount that the memory can hold, that the memory can remember, and it's limited in terms of duration. And one theorist, Miller, came up with the 7 plus or minus 2 rule that says that because our short-term memory only holds a certain amount of memory or information for a certain time frame, that we need to keep it between 5 and 7 units of information. That is, by the way, where we get 7-digit phone numbers, because they found that 7-digit phone numbers were easier to remember than longer phone numbers. And then we added, of course, the area codes to that. Also, the two-store model talks about how you can chunk pieces of information so that you can have more information in short-term memory than the 5 to 9 pieces of information that we just talked about. And then as they saw long-term memory they saw as being permanently stored, and that somehow it becomes activated as it is receives stuff from short-term memory. There's some back and forth between the two, and then you integrate what's in long-term memory with the information in short-term memory, and then it goes back to long-term memory when it's no longer needed for whatever the task or problem is. So that's the two-store model, 2 compartments or places where information is stored. Some of the key terms in the two-store model are the sensory register, and they saw that as how our senses, our 5 senses, each had their own register or place that received that information, received that stimulus. The 2 most studied senses in terms of learning and in terms of the register are verbal and auditory. Then the two-store model had, they explained how information got from short-term into long-term memory through the control or executive processes. And those are the processes they felt regulated the flow of information between the 2 storage units. So certainly rehearsal or repetition of information was one way that information got from short-term to long-term. So you used to have to memorize people's phone numbers so that you could retrieve that information from long-term memory later and call them. Now you just put it in your telephone. Coding, which is seen as the way to organize or put meaningful context to the stimulus or the information that you're getting in. So our brains organize our information so that when we see something with 4 legs and a back on it, we kind of figure out that that's a chair. Imaging, we use visual representations to help us remember and recall or retrieve information from long-term memory, that we implement decision rules to help us to regulate the flow of information, if this then that, and that's how information gets moved from one store to the other. That again, we organize information, or there's an executive process that helps us to organize information. Also, we monitor levels of understanding, or there's a process for us monitoring our levels of understanding. And then, of course, that one of the processes that needs to be controlled is how we retrieve information from long-term memory, so that we can integrate it with what the new information is, and then again store it in long-term memory. Then there was the levels of processing model, which is different from the two-store in that it saw not that there was a separate storage location, if you will, but that it was the type of information that controlled how that information was processed and stored. So they saw that there were 3 levels or depth of processing and information storage or memory. And so in the 3 levels are physical, acoustic, and semantic. So the physical level just looks at the surface of, in this case, visual learning. So in the example of the word wren, you would process physically, okay, it's not capitalized, so it's not somebody's name, like William. So that's one level of processing that happens particularly in visual learning. Acoustic level is the sounds. It's a little deeper processing, and so we are able through acoustic or our hearing to associate what we're learning with what we already know. So again, with the example wren, okay, wren sounds like den, so we can kind of associate it that way and process it like that. And then at the deepest level, according to this model, is the semantic level, and that's the level where we give what we're learning meaning. So again, in the example of the wren, we process that, and then there's some understanding in long-term memory that this is a type of bird, and so we make those connections as we're processing the information. And according to this model, the deeper level of the processing, then the more ingrained it is in memory. So this is important to those of us who are teaching, in that you always want to, at least according to this model, and really all the information processing models, you always want to make sure that you're able to make what you're teaching meaningful to your students. That if they don't already know the connections between what they already know and what they're learning, and they don't already know that it's important or it is meaningful, then you want to make that clear for them. Okay. If you want an enduring change, which is how we're defining learning, to occur. So the contemporary information processing model, again, also includes a number of theories that were described in the text. But basically, the contemporary model says that information comes through our senses, sensory input comes through our senses and goes to a sensory memory location. It is the reminder of a sensory register. They call it sensory memory. And that because we are not able to process all of the all of the things in our environment that kind of bombard our senses every day, that there are things that when we don't need to do anything with them, we don't need to really learn them, that they drop off. So the down arrow really looks at when things drop out of sensory memory because you don't have to attend to it. Then those things that we need to attend to go to working memory. And there, in working memory, a number of things happen according to this model. We'll talk a little bit more, but information is rehearsed. Information is transferred to and from long-term memory. So you'll see there are arrows going both ways. And that information that is not readily connected with long-term memory and is not adequately rehearsed will drop out. So let's say you do want to know somebody's phone number. They give you their phone number. You don't have your phone with you. If you don't say it in your head enough and rehearse it enough to get it into long-term memory, it will drop off and you will forget it. That makes good sense to me. So some of the key concepts in this model, the things that are particularly important that we'll spend a little time on, is attention. So in this model and in information processing, if the information is not attended to, is not focused on, is not, I don't know a better way to say that, focused on or paid attention to, attended to, either consciously or unconsciously, it will not get in the learning or in the information processing system. The second key term is about perception, and it is our perception that attaches meaning to what it is we're being bombarded with. So if you hear, let's say, they string together nonsense words that you won't perceive, ikum bikum bakum boo, you won't perceive that as meaningful. There's nothing in your memory that makes a connection with that. So perception can attach meaning to environmental inputs, and as we know, perception is different based on our own expectations, our own backgrounds, our own language, beliefs. All of those things help to shape perception, and so what is meaningful for some people may not be meaningful for other people. In coding, in the contemporary models, this is what we call the process of putting information into the processing system and really processing it so that it goes into long-term memory. And then rather than short-term memory, contemporary talks about working memory. And this is the memory of our immediate consciousness. And then long-term memory is where we store processed information and are able to retrieve from there to make new information meaningful. So attention. Attention is defined as concentrated mental activity that focuses, there's my word, that focuses on a limited amount of information in sensory memory and working memory. So it helps us, attention helps us focus on the information that our senses receive in sensory memory and that we're rehearsing and working on in our working memory. Conscious attention affects rehearsal in working memory. There is also attention that is unconscious, but it tends not to be selective, often not conscious, sometimes made so routine that we don't have to process it. And then it affects, attention affects processes involved in integrating knowledge from long-term memory. So really attention helps us not only rehearse things that are in working memory or understand that we need to rehearse it, focuses us on rehearsing it, or it helps us, attention helps us to process integrated knowledge that comes from long-term memory. So attention is really important to making sure the process of learning is completed. As attention becomes more conscious, it also increases the processing. So the more focused we are on the information, the more we'll process it, and the more it will wind up in our storage or in our long-term memory. So as teachers, we want to be mindful of focusing our students' attention for learning, and we can do that in a number of ways by using signals. Hi, we're ready to begin. This is really important. Using movement, because movement helps with keeping attention. Using variety, because again, variety of our tone and our voice, variety of our approach, variety of using different kinds of environmental stimulus or senses, making sure we have interest, or we are talking about things that are interesting or that our students are interested in, and making sure that we help people to process information by asking them questions about what they're learning. Perception, again, another key concept here. Perception attaches meaning to environmental inputs received through the senses. And again, sensory registers or sensory memory receives input from the environment, and the two most researched are visual or iconic sensory and auditory or echoic sensory registers or sensory memory. And then perception or pattern recognition helps us compare what we see or what's coming into our senses, what we hear, what we see, what we feel, to what we already have in our long-term memory or knowledge. So it does this in a couple of ways. Bottom-up processing says that information is received and then transferred to the working memory, then compared to information in the long-term memory to assign meaning. Top-down processing says that our perception is affected, what we find meaningful is affected by our expectations, our belief, and our prior knowledge. So kind of what I talked about in terms of different people will have different expectations, beliefs, knowledge, understanding that will help them to make meaning out of things that may not make meaning for other people. And then the way to compare the knowledge in long-term memory with what we're seeing coming in our senses. There are a couple of theories about how that happens. One is a template model, which has kind of been found to be too limiting, and replaced by the prototype model, which says that we store information in long-term memory as prototypes or as abstract forms, so that we don't have to recall specific detail, but we can kind of categorize them in prototypes. And that's how we store information so we store information about chairs in a chair prototype, so that anything with 4 legs and a back, as we see it, it'll bring up the prototype of chair, and we don't have to focus on each piece of that item. And then another little model about that is feature analysis, which is a variation of the prototype model, which basically says that we store critical features about the stimuli in long-term memory as images or as verbal codes. So it just talks about us picking up the features rather than calling it a prototype or model. Encoding. Again, encoding is how we process new information through this processing system. And in preparing it for storage, in long-term memory. And much of the encoding work really starts with your working memory or in your working memory. So input comes in, it's attended to, it goes into sensory memory or sensory register, we perceive it as meaningful, and then it goes into the working memory, and then encoding or again the way that gets prepared and processed to go into long-term memory begins really in working memory and is accomplished by making new information meaningful and integrating it with known information in long-term memory or storage. Encoding is influenced by a couple of things. So the encoding process can be developed by using elaboration and organization. And elaboration and organization lends to the development of what is called schemas, or big structures that help us to organize and store big pieces of information. So again, working memory is the memory of our immediate consciousness. Prior to this, it was called short-term memory, and basically this function resides in the frontal lobe of the brain. It has two critical functions in this working memory, and again, working memory, like short-term memory, is short in capacity and how much it can hold, and short in the amount of time that it can hold it, in duration, seconds. So what it does in working memory is it has to keep the information active by rehearsing it long enough so that it can retrieve information from long-term memory, integrate it with the new information, and then transfer it back to long-term memory, which is what we call learning. So in this contemporary model, one theorist, Baddeley, sees working memory in this model where there's a loop, and then in the middle, or the work that happens in this storage unit, is done by a central executive, which directs the processing of info in the working memory and the movement of knowledge into and out of long-term memory. These are just how these theorists have come up with explaining what they think is happening in the brain and in the mind when memory happens and when learning happens. So according to this model, the central executive helps focus attention. It helps divide attention as needed between two or more inputs. So as we get like the smell and the sight of a hamburger all at the same time, it helps divide the attention between the smell and the sight of it, and it helps us to control switching between tasks and then interfaces with long-term memory. So that's what Baddeley sees as the role of the central executive in our working memory. So the elaboration process, remember, elaboration and organization and schemas are three ways that help us to better process information between working and long-term memory. So elaboration process expands new information by adding to it or linking it to what's already known. So it assists in coding and retrieval by linking new information with other knowledge. You can rehearse the linkages, or you can have students rehearse the linkage between what new information you're getting and how it is connected to what they already know, or by new information and how it's connected to other new information. So anytime you help them expand upon expand upon the new knowledge, connect it to other knowledge. That's called elaboration. And again, you can do that by elaboration rehearsal, rehearsing the linkages, or by mnemonic strategies. So thinking about elaboration and mnemonic strategies, one that came to mind is I'm learning how, again, to play the piano. So one of the ways that I learned how to play the piano is by using mnemonic strategies. So on the treble clef, it's F-A-C-E are the keys in the spaces, and every good boy deserves fun is the mnemonic for the lines or the notes on the lines. And then there's another mnemonic for that on the bass clef. And the mnemonic strategies is how that became integrated into my memory. Organization is the second way that memory can be processed between working memory and long-term memory. And so well-organized material is easier to learn and to retrieve or recall from long-term memory. So we organize memory by chunking or grouping pieces of information into a whole. Remember Gestalt, we tend to do that anyway. By classifying information using a hierarchy. So our book gives us an example of learning the animal kingdom by learning the hierarchy of mammals and amphibians and reptiles, etc. Another way to organize is with mnemonic strategies that I just gave you an example of, and also with mental imagery, so the use of graphics and audio visuals. So then when you organize things into large amounts of information in a system, that's called a schema. So when you structure large amounts of information into a big system, that's called a schema. And elaboration and organization helps us form these giant chunks, if you will, or schemas. And it also developing schemas assist in generating and controlling kind of routine actions that happen in sequence. And I can't think of an example of that right now, but we remember these schemas. How do we do addition? We do one side and then we go to the next side and then we go to the equal. Okay, so, or how we do multiplication, or different ways that we set up these routine sequential actions. Okay, and then lastly, long-term memory is our storage. And there are theories about different kinds of storage and how they are connected. So we look at long-term memory, or this model looks at long-term memory kind of as neural connections and how they work in the brain, that they kind of are connected and interact with one another. One of the theories, activation theory or ACT model, part of the ACT model makes me think of kind of the synapses that happen between neurons, and that's how one memory will activate another memory and bring that out of long-term storage. So there's declarative knowledge, which is knowing that something is the case. These are facts, beliefs, opinions, theories, attitudes, and they are represented in chunks of basic information and related categories. And then there's procedural knowledge. That's the knowledge of how to perform certain cognitive activities. So how to solve a math problem, how to surf the web, how to perform lab techniques. That's considered procedural knowledge. And it's thought that these are stored in networks as verbal codes or images that help us recreate these patterns. Information processing sees how things are stored in long-term memory in terms of propositional networks. And so propositions are the basic units of knowledge and meaning in the long-term memory or in our storage. So we don't put in long-term memory individual words, but we put propositions. That's how we remember things according to this model, in propositions. And propositions are the smallest unit of information that can be judged as right or wrong. So I am good in math. We don't remember I and then we remember am, but we remember the proposition. I'm good in math. And these propositions are formed according to a set of rules. And then these propositions then are put in networks where they're linked with other propositions. So these propositional networks are sets of interrelated propositions. In the ACT model, they call this network model ACT-R, and they see that propositions are related when they share a common element. Either there's a link between the subject and the predicate, or relation, argument. I can't explain those to you right now. If you have questions, let me know after you reread this piece. Anderson et al. Posits that a single set of cognitive process account for all of the learning that happens, and essentially it's a computer program designed to simulate learning, and it tends to explain performance better than learning. So the ACT theory again talks about that ACT-R in terms of how we relate propositions. Also, activation theory talks about how these propositions or networks become activated and connect. So they talk about that it's a network of nodes, which are concepts that link to other concepts, and that the nodes in the networks correspond to levels of activation, and active nodes process better than inactive nodes, and basically that activation can spread along the network, and if you activate this piece of long-term memory, it also can connect and activate another piece of long-term memory at the same time. So these are just kind of theories about how that whole retrieval storage process happens in long-term memory. Other models talk about production systems. Again, this is part of ACT theory, and that again is a kind of what the rules are around how a network is coordinated. Connectionist model is similar to an ACT model. Also a computer program kind of that simulates the learning process. Again, they look at it kind of as a neural system processing. It seems to explain perception, meaning how we take in information and assign meaning to it all the way at the beginning of the process, rather than how we explain learning or how things get to be stored in long-term memory and then create an enduring change. So this is these are some of the concepts in that model. Okay, I'm almost at 40 minutes, so let me tell you what I think is important for you to understand in this whole chapter is how to apply some of these concepts to teaching. And so we can be the active external condition to learning, as Gagne calls it, by how we present material to our class, present material to our learners, so that the kinds of rehearsing and attention and perception and retrieval processes that need to happen to get things into long-term memory and to learn them happen. So one method is advanced organizers. These are statements we can make right at the beginning to help learners connect the new learning that we're trying to give to them with what they already know or their prior learning. Gagne talks about conditions of learning. The conditions of learning, as he describes them, are learning outcomes. Basically, what is it that you're wanting the student to learn? Learning events, what are the things you need to do to prepare and activate that learning and then transfer it to long-term memory, and then setting up learning hierarchies so that it is easier to retrieve the information when you need it. And then the last is cognitive load theory and its importance in how much information and at what pace you give learners information so that they can actually learn it, so it can get through the processing and become stored in long-term memory. Okay, so here are his 5 types of learning outcomes, and he says the conditions that impact learning include the internal conditions. This is internal to the learner, so do they have the prerequisite skills and the ability to process what it is you're giving them? Do they have the capability to process? And so things like attention deficit, other learning disabilities can be an internal condition that will slow down or hinder the learning process. Those are internal conditions that impact learning. External conditions are the environmental stimuli that supports the learner's cognition or their processing. And we as teachers can often shape that environmental stimuli so that we can make sure that we attach visual images along with what we're talking about, that we use variety to gain attention and movement, and that we make sure that we connect what we want them to learn with what they already know so that they can do some of that retrieval and a connection and make it meaningful for them and for learning to occur. So the learning events, again, are preparation, where you want to focus on making sure they're attending, making sure they expect, or there's some expectancy that they will learn this and that they have prior knowledge that they can connect to it, and do what you can to start that retrieval process. So things like giving pretests or having a question at the beginning of a class about what you learned in your reading will help begin the retrieval process before you start teaching the new information. Awesome. Acquisition and performance is the next event. So you want to give out the information, and then you want to make sure that they have opportunity to rehearse it, to practice it, to perform it, to get reinforcement and feedback on it. So those are the things you want to happen for learning to take place. And then you want to make sure that they're able to transfer what they learned in the classroom, in their reading, so that it is retrieved and used out where they may need it. So you don't just want them to be able to do a math problem or a science problem in the classroom, but you want them to be able to apply it outside of the classroom when they're having to balance their checkbook or actually work on a dental patient. So those are the events or factors of learning for Gagne, and how we as teachers can shape our lessons, shape our curriculum, and shape our presentation so that the maximum amount of learning can occur. And this is his learning hierarchy, so that we understand what the target is, or what the target skill or understanding is we're shooting for, and do we have to make sure that we teach lower level skills before they can get to what their target is. So I kind of talked about this piano again, and so before you can say, I want to teach you to play the piano, you have to break that down. So first you have to teach them how to read notes, or what the notes are on the keyboard and what they sound like. How to use both hands, the motor skill of using both hands. You have to do that foundational skill building and teaching before you move up to reading music, and then finally their target skill of playing the piano. And then the cognitive load theory, lastly, really speaks about how the amount of information, the pace of information impacts whether or not students will be able to perceive it, take it in, rehearse it, connect it well enough to really learn it. And so there are limitations in our working memory before it gets to long-term memory. So making sure that we decrease extraneous kinds of information that may take up resources really needed for what is essential to what we want to teach them, or what we need them to learn, and what is essential for them to process it enough to get it to long-term memory. So there's stuff that you can take out of a syllabus, there's stuff that you can take off of a PowerPoint, or off of what you're asking them to take in, or pace it differently, so that you don't overload the system and they lose most of what you want them to gain. I hope this has been helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. At the end of the week, you have quiz 3, which will include information from this week's reading in PowerPoint and last week's reading. So chapters 4 and 5. Weeks 4 and 5 will be included in quiz 3. Look forward to talking to you next week. We're going to be focused on the how do we retrieve and transfer information in long-term memory so that learning can be applied. Thanks.